Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of What's the Res? My name is Josh Herring. I'm the Dean of Students and Head of Debate for Thales Academy in Rolesville, North Carolina, and tonight I'll be your host on this episode of What's the Res? We here at What's the Res are dedicated to hosting the ongoing conversation about the current resolutions in the world of high school debate. Tonight, we'll be discussing the March 2020 Public Forum resolution, which reads, Resolved, the United States should increase its use of nuclear energy for commercial energy production. And I am so pleased to be joined by an expert in commercial nuclear power. Dr. Andrew Spencer is a supervisor operator who oversees requalification training at a commercial nuclear power plant. He is also a senior research fellow for the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, an adjunct professor for Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a PhD in Christian ethics from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Spence, welcome to What's the Res?
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be on.
I'm so glad you're willing to do this. I know it's, I don't think we've ever actually met in person, if I remember correctly.
No, we have not yet. No.
You were so gracious a few years back. I remember I was trying to figure out how on earth to make a little bit of extra cash to meet an unexpected tax bill. And you were well ahead of me in the writing for the internet game. And a mutual friend connected us, and you helped me find a writing contest. So, but I've enjoyed following your work over the years. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of where you've gone from seminary and what you're doing now. What's your story?
Okay, so, I guess I'll start a little farther back, right? Because it's pertinent to the question.
Sure.
So I went to the Naval Academy and graduated with a Bachelor of Science in English, which exists. And then so I went from there into the submarine force. So got into Navy nuclear power, spent 6.5 years there, learned, qualified on 3 different reactors. And then when I got out, I intended to go to seminary. And then I moved up to Wake Forest, needed a job, and saw a posting for a job down at the Sharon Harris nuclear power plant down there in New Hill, North Carolina. And so I worked there for 5 years as an instructor while I finished up an MDiv and started a PhD. I was able to work at seminary for a couple of years on staff, and that was a really enjoyable time. And then I got recruited to go out to Oklahoma Baptist University, where I served as the director associate vice president for institutional effectiveness was my final title, where I did accreditation stuff and worked through that, where I finished my PhD in Christian ethics. And then after a couple of years, was looking for something different, and then came back to commercial nuclear power. And now I live in Michigan, and I supervise operations requalification programs. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. Those seem like 2 separate worlds. Do you find that do your studies in Christian ethics overlap with your work in the nuclear power field, or are those separate parts of life?
Well, I mean, at some level, I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do when I grow up. So, we'll see. My wife and I have a running joke about the number of job changes I've had, which I'd like to minimize in the future, but we'll see. But no, there's a lot of overlap. So, for example, I brought a lot of the thinking and the learning that I did as a Christian ethicist in the PhD program to my current job. I've helped to develop a leadership program based on character and getting people to think, even in a secular environment, about who we are matters to what we do and how successful we are in being, good stewards of our roles. So there's a lot of overlap. I also have opportunities to discuss my faith and with people that have deep questions that I'm able to answer because of the education. And so, it's a lot of fun.
Oh, that's wonderful. I know we have, so I'm also a high school teacher by day and a PhD student by night. And last year we had our first year, we had a student who was aiming for the Naval Academy. He ended up going to Georgia Tech, and he was deferred at the Naval Academy, but they accepted his application. He's currently trying to decide whether he should, in fact, go to the Naval Academy and kind of restart after he's already finished. He's in the middle of finishing up freshman year at Georgia. And would you recommend going to the Naval Academy if people have the opportunity to do so?
Yeah, I mean, the first year's rough for everyone, and then after that, I had a really good time. So I have friends there that I've met that I still keep in touch with. So it was a good experience. I'd do it again, even knowing what I know now.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I do love how your story really illustrates a lot of the value in a solid liberal arts foundation. If you were an English major at the Naval Academy, because my students so frequently have a precise career path in mind from even the beginning days of high school. And I never tire of reminding them that they cannot predict the future and they do not know what direction life's going to take them. So they are very well served with a broad foundation. Well, let's get into our topic matter for tonight. Spence, I'll confess that I'm one of the many people who appreciate what you do and other nuclear power professionals do, though I don't really understand it. And I think that kind of understanding is going to be really important for getting into this resolution. So in a few minutes, could you just help us know a little bit more about how exactly nuclear power works? How do we get electricity from rocks that don't burn?
Okay, so the fundamentals of nuclear power, the way the commercial power industry works, we mine ore. Well, some company out there mines ore, and uranium is a naturally occurring element out there. Heavier elements tend to be less stable, and so there's a certain number of elements that you actually, if you can split their nucleus, you get more energy out than it took to actually make it split. Uranium is one of those. So most of the uranium out there is uranium-238, which is not very fissile. It doesn't split very easily. But we look for the uranium-235, and actually what they do is they use a centrifuge to separate out uranium-235 and what they call enrich it. And so we load in commercial nuclear power our fuel with little pellets of what is about somewhere between 3 and 5%. Uranium-235. And those little pellets that get stacked into rods that then get put into fuel bundles, and we put about 185 of them in a boiling water reactor and about 52 of them, and it depends on the size, but in a PW or a pressurized water reactor, they will take those and that's what we shoot a neutron at. So we shoot the neutron at the uranium. When the neutron hits the uranium nucleus, it gets excited. It has a lot of extra energy that gets put into it as long as the neutron is the right energy level. And when it gets just so, there's a probability that you're going to get it to split. Now, about every neutron that hits a uranium-235 gives you about 2.4 more neutrons out and a bunch of heat that happens. And that 2.4 is what allows you then to make more fissions that happen because we lose some along the way because they just don't hit the right target and that sort of thing. And then the heat is actually what then makes the water hot. And the water, then we boil the water, and then the water then turns the turbine, and then the turbine then goes around, and there's magnets involved, electromagnetics, and that in the end is what produces your electricity.
So this really is a matter of producing the energy to turn the turbines, which is where that turning of the turbines is what's producing the electricity.
Yeah. The only difference between a coal power plant and a nuclear power plant is what's making the water hot.
Oh, okay. How is that a similar process to military uses of nuclear power, or are these completely separate things?
Well, so the fundamentals are the same. In military nuclear power, it's a higher concentration because, and there's some other differences in terms of reliability because there's not much danger of a torpedo coming to hit my commercial nuclear power plant. And I don't have multiple people, their lives dependent on being several hundred feet below the water with a need to have propulsion that keeps us safe. And so there's differences in design philosophy and reliability, but the biggest difference is really just how enriched the fuel is. The general principles are all the same.
That's fascinating. So is this method of developing or of producing electricity, how long has this been a part of the United States electrical grid?
So I can't think off the top of my head when it was either the late 50s or the early 60s when the first plants went commercial. Being commercial, so it is when we shut the breaker and actually start running the meter to charge people. There's a period before that where you actually generate power and you're testing and that sort of thing.
Sure.
It usually takes 3 to 4 years. But so it's been about 50 to 60 years that there's been commercial nuclear power. And, some of those plants are still operating safely after all those years.
Wow. Okay. And how widespread is this, both within the United States and then also are there lots of other countries that use this method for producing commercial electricity? Well,
there's about a little over 120 nuclear facilities, like commercial power facilities in the United States, with more reactors because some of them some have 1, some have 2, some have 3, a few have 4 units on them as well. And so there's a bunch of reactors. We make about 20 to 25% of the power that people in the United States use. Germany is shutting theirs down after concerns with Fukushima. France is really the highest percentage. We have the largest total megawatts we produce through nuclear power, but France is a higher percentage. South Africa has got a power plant. China has several. Japan still has some. India has some. So it's pretty well widespread throughout the UK, Scandinavia, and countries. There's some up there. So it's pretty widespread.
Well, that's really interesting because I think my mental picture of a nuclear power plant is probably more shaped by The Simpsons and Homer like asleep with a big button and it's about to all go kaboom than it is anything else. I don't think I realized just how widespread this network of nuclear power plants was.
Yep, and Homer's not very accurate.
That's good to know.
That is good to know. And the interesting thing about the commercial nuclear power industry is we are very interconnected. So there's a World Association of Nuclear Operators that is all these plants, and we'll send people over to do inspections at other plants and compare notes. When somebody else learns something about a process, even if it's administrative process, we'll share that information pretty readily.
So there's kind of an obvious way of developing best practices and keeping up with kind of the state of the art then.
Yep.
So, and I'm assuming is that motivated by safety concerns or desires to expand nuclear production, or what's the motivation behind that kind of collaboration within this industry?
Well, so a lot of it, so in the U.S., it came out of the incident at 3 Mile Island in 1979. And the realization that another plant had a similar event that didn't have the same negative consequence. And so as they were looking at, how are we going to prevent something like this from happening again in the U.S., it became evident that we were better off working together, sharing information on these levels, because you can't just build a nuclear power plant in somebody else's backyard and compete with them. So it's not in that sense, we don't compete as strongly as like a car company might. And so it works a lot better. It helps us prevent. We self-regulate at some level. Like we still respond to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and there's actually 2 inspectors that work at my power plant. And they don't work for the company, they work for the federal government. But they're there, they come to our meetings, they can go anywhere they want, we can't stop them, and we have a good relationship with them. But at the end of the day, they're there to watch us. But we then, as an industry, talk with one another and hold each other accountable. So, in April, I'm going to another site to go through their training material and evaluate them and give them feedback on what they can do better.
Oh, that is fascinating. That's a really interesting public-private partnership kind of idea. That is fascinating. Well, so we are definitely we're a debate podcast, as I mentioned earlier, and we're focusing on this as a debate resolution. The previous debate resolution, as several of our listeners I'm sure will be familiar, focused on getting rid of nuclear weapons. So this is probably a basic question, I assume, but I think it'll be helpful for our audience. How exactly is the development of nuclear energy for commercial energy production different from the development of nuclear weapons capacity? Besides the obvious that we're not trying to attack someone else with the development of a new electrical plant or anything like that. Besides the defense, offense, or the irrelevance of that, how are these things different from each other?
Well, when you look at the processing of the uranium, it's not substantially different. They just a nuclear weapon is somewhere in the high 90s percent, like a uranium-235. So it's, as opposed to the 3 to 5 that is in our fuel, it's way more enriched, which means that you're going to get with a smaller payload, a larger energy release. And so the biggest difference is basically how long and how energy intense the enrichment process is. So, in theory, and not to get into the political aspect of it, but the questions with the Iranian nuclear deal, and, we had the treaty that allowed them to enrich for nuclear power, but not enrich for weapons. And we, those questions, the only difference is how long, basically, and how much energy. It's the same process there. There are big differences, though, in the way that you have to handle that fuel or that nuclear material because of the concentration. So our uranium-235 at 3 to 5% is pretty stable, right? We pull it out of the reactor core, and we disassemble it about every 18 to 24 months to change out and put new fuel in. And so it's highly radioactive, but it's not at all explosive, right? You could hit it with a hammer, you could whatever, and there wouldn't be an issue with it.
Okay, so but the more highly enriched it is, the more unstable it becomes.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
So then this really, there is an inherent safety factor then here, but what you're describing sounds like a very safe, controlled process. Like it's not prone, this does not sound like an accident-prone industry or process. Is that accurate?
We are painfully slow. A lot of times there's a lot of care that's taken. When mistakes are made, it's usually paperwork or things that are so well within the design margin. Because what they do in order to protect us from ourselves is, they'll load extra poisons that stop neutrons in the racks for spent fuel, so that even if you put the wrong assemblies next to each other, you couldn't go critical. And, so we don't make those mistakes very often, and we fix them right away if anybody made one of those mistakes. But even if we did, it really wouldn't be consequential. We'd just be not in accordance with our own procedures. And so, there's a lot of safety margin and a lot of processes that help us stay on the rails.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit over to some of the benefits of affirming the resolution. So I know the big argument I've heard about why we should have more nuclear power has something to do with it really has a lot to do with a sustainable source of energy. Is this more sustainable than our current methods of producing electricity? I know you mentioned coal a few moments ago. And are there other kind of major methods of producing electricity in the status quo?
Okay, so, when you look at, I don't know the numbers, somebody could look that up online pretty easily, but when you look at, we produce a good portion, about a quarter of the total electricity in the country. Coal is another significant contributor. Natural gas is another significant contributor that is also pretty clean from a carbon standpoint if global warming or climate change is a major concern. And there are additionally, it's a relatively small portion of our total our grid power is from wind and solar. Coal, when you look at coal, that's really the highest carbon output. So if that's your concern, that's a major issue. And it also, when you just look at the sheer mass, if you drive by a coal power plant and are able to see their fuel pile, it looks like a mountain of coal. And that's about 6 to 7 days of fuel. So that gets turned over, that gets burnt on a regular basis. That's an ongoing thing, and it's a lot of fuel to power that. As opposed to, our core is about, 12 feet by 12 feet. It's about a cube of 12, so 12 by 12 by 12. And that'll take us for 18 months, and we only trade out about a third of that. And then natural gas is less carbon dense, and it still gets a lot of power in there. So it's actually a fairly clean resource. And right now, based on fracking and some of the other deposits that we found in the United States and in Canada, that's actually a really cheap way to make electricity right now. But and then when you look at the other resources, wind and solar, those are clean, at least largely clean. I mean, there's always carbon to get it put up. There's always carbon to take it down. There's carbon to maintain. So it's never carbon free in a true sense. But at the same time, wind and solar have some potential. The issue with wind and solar is you've got to have sun and you got to have wind. And so they're intermittent. And unfortunately, when you don't just turn on your lights, and you don't just need your iron lung in the hospital when it's sunny out. You need it when it's gloomy or when it's a calm day. And so any sort of grid has to have they've either got to advance the batteries, which is what people are talking about. And right now we don't have the technology. We're not close to the technology on that. Or you have to have baseload units. And your choices for baseload units right now basically are nuclear, coal, and natural gas. So in the end, I think that nuclear, we're pretty close to carbon free. And I think that we're a pretty good option in terms of the baseload units for the future. The issue we're having right now is that natural gas is really cheap, which makes nuclear is expensive to build, and that is dampening our growth and continued operation.
Oh, that's really interesting, because that could give a really good access to the affirmative on this resolution. So debaters, here's at least my thought on that if the United States should increase its use of nuclear energy for commercial energy production, one good affirmative argument or pro-argument in public forum could involve advocating for specific funding to offset the startup cost of developing nuclear power plants in underserved regions that either have low access to other ways of developing electricity or are showing signs of coal petering out within coming generations. Now, Spence, tell us a little bit about what you mentioned that. So uranium is an element that is mined. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. So how easy is that to mine? And does the mining of uranium have kind of ecological downsides?
Well, the mining of anything has ecological downsides. And I don't know as much about the mining processes because I've been on the energy production side.
Sure.
But both the mining and the enrichment it takes energy to make energy. It doesn't matter what you do. And so everything comes down to a question of trade-offs. And, basically we use a portion of our electricity could be said to be going to the enrichment process, because that's actually a fairly high energy intensive process. And then some of the energy or some of it could go to the mining operation. So, in the end, we're net lower carbon than coal by a significant margin, and again, less carbon than natural gas. But anybody that said we're not really carbon free and nothing is.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think I've heard I'm trying to remember where I ran into some argument about there was an unexpected it was in a congressional debate round where they were arguing about why we should go back to the gold standard. And one of the negative arguments was about the ecological harms of gold mining. And I did not expect that to come up, but it got me thinking about that. Like, what does it take to acquire uranium? But I think that the fact that we can never be carbon free is really interesting. I think I'm sure people would like to say we could, but that makes sense that we could never actually have a true carbon zero operation. Well, now, what are the benefits of increasing commercial nuclear energy output? Would this also help us be better stewards of nature in any way?
So I think yes. And there's some significant reasons for that. So a few years ago, for example, in North Carolina, there was a coal ash pond that broke. And people don't think about people think about the hazards of nuclear power and live in your nuclear power plant. I would by far rather live next to a nuclear power plant than I would rather than to a coal plant, for example, because we pollute less in a kind of not just the carbon way, which we don't really see the carbon, but we pollute less in the sense of we don't have any smoke. Our site is really actually pretty clean. As it goes, I mean, there's dirt, but it's clean dirt, so it's an ecologically friendly endeavor. If you ever drive by cooling towers, those things everybody thinks are the thing for nuclear power. The big, tall, kind of concave towers. That's not smoke that's coming out the top. That's just water vapor. And so what we do is we may be concentrating some lake water a little bit. But that's about it. So nuclear power, I think, is one of the cleanest forms of energy. One of the counter arguments is, what do you do with the waste? And that is one of the hardest things that we have to answer right now, because the waste is radioactive for an extended period of time afterward. Now, different countries have learned to deal with that in different ways. So France actually reprocesses their nuclear waste, and they re-enrich it so that then so uranium-235 is spent, but of that uranium-238, some of those uranium-238s pick up a neutron, they beta decay into plutonium-238 or 239, and then plutonium-239 is also a nuclear fuel. And that's actually what you want for bombs too, which is why we don't do it in the United States, because when Jimmy Carter passed the SALT Treaty with the former Soviet Union, what was the Soviet Union, we both agreed to stop reprocessing. And so that's the biggest question we have out there, is what to do with the waste. But to put it in a frame of reference, so the amount of waste that the Harris plant had produced in about 40-something years of commercial operation fit into a space about the size of a high school pool. If we took all of the nuclear waste from all of the fuel from all of the reactor plants in the United States and put them in a single area in dry storage, it would take a footprint about the size of the Superdome. And so we're looking at an issue that has to be addressed and that we have to figure out a solution to, but that it isn't insurmountable in size or in technology. And in fact, technology has advanced to the point where most plants right now have a dry storage license, where in addition to our spent fuel pools, we actually also have spent fuel storage on site. And it's prevented from ever going critical based on design and spacing and the chemical composition of the caskets, and then the casks are basically rated. So, you could fly a Boeing 747 into it and it'd still be there, and it might have, some surface damage. So those are the big issues, and we're still wrestling with some of those in there.
No, that's really helpful. And I'm assuming that, like the carbon issue, there's no way to have an energy production facility without waste. So this becomes a question of, how do you manage the waste that is produced in the process? That's something, no matter, even if we shifted completely to a different method of producing energy, there would still be waste of some sort to then deal with in that process.
Absolutely. There's heavy metals in solar power. I have solar panels on my roof, and when the 25 or 30-year lifespan is expired, I've got to figure out a way to dispose of those heavy metals that are potentially damaging. There's ecological costs not quite as high as some people like to make out, but there are birds that do die with windmills, and they have heavy metals and other things waste that has to be disposed. And coal ash, like I said, that's an issue. In fact, this is one of the reasons why I'd rather live close to nuclear power than coal. It's because of the ash, because that is there's a lot of arsenic and a lot of other nasty things in there that we figured out a way to process, but some of those things it takes a long time to get rid of, just like nuclear power. So it's all about trade-offs, right? And there is no perfect solution if we're going to have some of the technologies and some of the comforts and some of the life-saving opportunities that we've got. You've got to have some sort of source, and it's going to be waste and offshoot that you have to deal with.
This past summer, I read a novel by scientist Homer Hickam, the guy from the movie October Sky a few years ago. And he sets it's the novelization of his own boyhood, and he sets it in Colwood, West Virginia. As you were talking about the coal ash, reminded me of the novel, and I mean he has this fascinating description of I think he was 12 or 13 in this section of the story where he wakes up one night and he just hears his dad coughing, and his dad hacks up a giant load of coal dust, basically. And his dad eventually, a couple years later, develops a black spot on his lung. That's sort of, it's a death knell to a coal miner. It takes years for that to work its way out and be the death sentence. But once that spot has developed, a coal miner knows that he only has so long. And I think for years we've been a very coal dependent electrical grid system. There's certainly been a lot of harms to the people who have been involved in that in terms of their own health, but there's also been a lot of economic opportunities there as well. Are there inherent physical dangers to working in a nuclear power plant? I mean, with radioactive material, is that harmful to the people who are in that industry?
So our total industrial safety rating is actually one of the best of all industries. You're safer working in commercial nuclear power on average, right, than you are even in an office, right? When you look at you look at the injuries that we have on site, which we have a couple every now and again, and OSHA recordables. Like last year we had a bee sting, and we had somebody that was moving a part that could have happened anywhere in the warehouse, and it dropped on his foot. And then we had somebody that hurt themselves in the office. I can't remember what that was. But, so a lot of them are just life. Actual injuries due to the nuclear part, I can't think of one at either of the plants that I've been part of in that time. So it's a very safe industry. When you look at the ratings across, and I think it's the Department of Labor that has the statistics, but it's good to work there. Now, that being said, on the other hand, we do get exposed to contamination and radioactive material. As an instructor, and having been in the nuclear Navy, my lifetime dose is really, really low. Now, I've been at mostly pretty low dose plants, which has helped. And I don't do a lot of maintenance work because I'm a guy that works with my head and not with my hands, and so I don't get exposed as much. But what's happened is that if you take a cross country flight, you get about 300 millirem of dose, right, of radiation exposure due to the rays from the sun. If you eat a banana, you get, because of the potassium and the amount of radioiodides in the potassium and the other minerals in there, you actually get more dose than I get on a weekly or monthly basis. If you live in an area, which Raleigh is, that has radon inversions, you'll get more dose from radon than I got in a year while I was working at Harris. And so, it's all relative. You'll get more. You can get a lot more from X-rays than you can get working in nuclear power. We're actually capped by the federal government at 5 rem per year, and each site limits everybody to 2 rem per year. And so actually the nuclear industry, one of those things that we do to cooperate is when a worker goes from one place to another, we share the information about how much dose they've had so that they don't exceed that 2 rem limit. When you look at medical statistics, you need to be up into the 10 to 15 range, 10 to 15 rem range before you see any sort of effects, medically speaking. And when you talk about the nuclear sickness that came after the atomic bombs, that's closer to 20 to 30 rem in a very short period of time.
So that is fascinating, because I suspect one of the biggest arguments that the con is going to try to raise is that by doing this, there will be an obvious harm to the people who then work in those facilities. And you just gave us a great list of places for students to go research for those specific numbers, and even great examples to show where that's really not the case. That this is a manageable concern, and that with proper regulation and oversight and collaboration, that it's not a difficult thing to keep track of. Well, now, I remember, oh goodness, I think it's been at least a year, if not a little bit more than a year now, since freshman Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposed her Green New Deal. Ethan and I, he's my co-host, Ethan and I we did an episode on the Green New Deal. It was our very first bonus episode. So listeners, if you want to go back to that, I think it's like episode 4 or 5 in the catalog. But we sort of did a roast of the Green New Deal as one episode, because it was just so much fun to read through the document and just mock the logical inconsistencies of that. But she attacks nuclear power pretty hardcore in that document. So there's not going to be any kind of development of nuclear power. And yet at the same time, where you've showed us plenty of things, it seems like increasing nuclear power could reduce carbon output from coal sources primarily, and possibly other places as well. Why the stigma in the Green New Deal against nuclear power? What are your thoughts?
So, I mean, the nuclear industry has 3 significant events in its history. 3 Mile Island in the United States, which actually isn't that significant, but it was scary. Because people didn't know what's going on. Then you have Chernobyl that happened in 1983, which was a big event, and that actually raised the level of background radiation on the globe because it released enough radioactive material. And then in 2011, you have the incident at Fukushima Daiichi, where they had a long-term event that caused them to spread. But so I think that's a big piece of it. I think also that some people in the environmental movement, and I'm an environmentalist myself, I just come at it from a different angle, but some people think that there's not going to be trade-offs, that we can do something like solar and wind, and that's it, right? And that's going to be it. And they're not thinking about, I think, some of the difficulties in battery storage issues. So I think on one level, it's kind of pie in the sky. I think the other piece that happens is that there is a connection in people's mind between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And, it's similar technology and there's a lot of connection, but there's a huge difference in the concentration, and you can measure those things and it's pretty obvious. So I think that's a big piece of it. The other piece is that and there's studies that show this, that people are afraid of what they don't understand. And we all understand how a coal plant works within reason, right? You burn dirt and it makes the water hot, and the water turns to steam and it makes the turbine spin, right? That's pretty simple. But the idea of a neutron, shooting a neutron at this little bit of uranium and having it split and make more energy, and when you turn the switch off, that you don't it immediately stop making power, which is one of the differences between nuclear power and every other form of power generation. That scares people, and they don't understand it. And people don't understand radioactivity, because they, when you start to bring the C word into it, cancer, right? Because radiation can, over time, if it's hit, and if you're exposed to it in a certain way, it does, slightly increase. And if you get a lot of radiation, significantly increase your risk of cancer. And so those things are pretty scary to people, and we don't teach it, right? Because I don't remember in my high school physics class anything more than like a day on this is what happens with fission, and I'm sure that I forgot that shortly after the test. And so it really, the uncertainty scares people a whole lot.
It seems like this will be a great resolution for students to dig into and really get a grasp on the real possibilities here, and hopefully that knowledge will dispel some of the myths involved in the nuclear power industry, with replacing those myths with facts. Okay, so let's shift gears then towards your thoughts about the future of nuclear power. Do you think it's likely that we will see the increase of nuclear power plants across the United States and the expansion of this method of developing electricity, or something different for the future of the nuclear power industry?
Well, the plants that we have are mostly they're getting older. There are two more power plants in construction down in Georgia. The problem with the plans and what we've been doing is it's incredibly big and incredibly expensive. But I'm actually pretty hopeful about the future of nuclear power in general. I don't think we're going to see a lot more single, 1,200 megawatt plants like we have in the past. But there's a company out there developing a technology for small reactors. It's called NuScale. And instead of being 1,200 megawatts, they're about 50 megawatts each. That changes the game. So now at a location, you put 10 of these smaller nuclear plants, these smaller 10 reactors in there, right? You're producing 500, you can scale it up a little bit. But the chances that you'd have a system malfunction on all of them at the same time go down significantly. And so the risk goes down significantly. We play by the odds. Everybody does. Everything does. There's always a chance that something's going to fail. And so we play in the 10 to the minus 8th to 10 to the minus 10th chance that things are going to happen. Right. And this improves that by a couple of orders of magnitude by having a smaller scale. And they've also taken some of the lessons that we've learned over the last 40 years. One of the things that could be improved about the way the existing plants operate, we can't change those, but when we build new things, right, a thing that we've learned is that it's better to have your safety systems that operate without electricity. Because believe it or not, as a nuclear power plant, one of our biggest problems or concerns is making sure that we always have electricity in order to run the pumps to keep the water moving to make sure that we don't overheat after we shut down. So these smaller scale plants actually are passive systems, and they're small enough that you can stick them into a vat of water, and they sit in a vat of water that can provide up to 3 months of cooling passively, right? So no operator action, something goes wrong, and it has cooling capacity for the long term in there. And then the likelihood of not being able to get in is very limited. So I think that these things, they're going to be cheaper to build because now with large scale nuclear power, you have to have special forges that actually make our vessels and all our stuff. So it has to be shipped in on cargo ships and railroad cars and so forth. With the NuScale, it's more like a semi-truck. And so it takes a less technology. There's not a backlog on it. It's a lot easier to build. A lot of the stuff can actually be built in a warehouse or in a factory someplace and then shipped. So it's going to cut the cost down. It's going to reduce the risk even more. And it has a lot of benefit, I think, for a pretty clean energy source for the future.
That is fascinating, and the scaling down of that to a smaller size is really interesting. Is this something that would you expect to see a lot of other nations? I know you mentioned several European countries, and also China and Japan both have this as well. Is this something that if the United States is not willing to develop this, is this something we would be behind other countries in 20, 30 years from now?
I do think it's going to grow. In fact, I just got a job posting from a plant that in Eastern Europe they're starting construction. The UAE has a couple of plants that are getting ready to start up in the next year, and China is ahead of us in some of the technology. So we built we're building 2 of these AP1000 big reactors. They've got a dozen or so that they're building. And so, worldwide, I think nuclear power is on the rise.
Well, Dr. Spencer, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. Are there any resources you would recommend for students to get into with our target audience, are high school students, but bright high school students who are motivated to do deep dives into good research, and preferably research that's maybe slightly less accessible than just Googling, hey, what are the latest stats on nuclear power? What resources would you steer students towards?
So there's like 3 different TED Talks out there that provide pretty decent overviews. And so if you search that, there's actually one that's a pro and con where it's actually debate that happens. So that might be a good source that you could take in 10 to 15 minutes per chunk. But when it comes to other sources, so if you're looking for cons, the Union of Concerned Scientists has a website that they post a lot of cons. And they're opposed to nuclear power. So that's a pretty good source if you're looking for the counter arguments. I think NC Warren there in North Carolina also has some stuff there. I don't always think they're factually accurate or take the risks well, but they do have some counter arguments that need to be wrestled with. On the positive side, the NRC, so nrc.gov, there's information about the basics of nuclear power if somebody wanted to learn how it works. But they're understandably kind of neutral on it. But you could also go to the nuclear, the NEI, Nuclear Energy Institute, which is going to basically, it has a pretty good explanation of this is what they're trying to sell nuclear power. So it has a lot of positives in there. And so, I mean, that's where I'd start. If I were to recommend one book, Why We Need Nuclear Power by Michael Fox. So Why We Need Nuclear Power by Michael Fox. And it's actually pretty accessible. It's from Oxford University Press. And but you could probably get it in a library loan or something like that. And he lays out most of the arguments and counter arguments. He's going to give the details about the cross-country flights and how much exposure you get, and all those sorts of kind of key pieces of information. And he wrestles with some of the hard questions as well. So that's a pretty good source.
Excellent. Now, Dr. Spencer, you've given us a wonderful overview of your field, and I'd be remiss if I let you go without without asking your advice. You've been in the Navy, you've been in the professional world, you've also been a long-term student and come back to graduate school and doctoral work. What advice would you offer to high school students who are thinking either about heading straight to college or perhaps thinking about maybe a season in the workforce before college, or just head straight to the workforce? What advice would you offer students in those positions?
Well, first of all, there's the realization that you'd never know where you're going to end up. Because if you'd asked me as a high school senior if I thought I was going to end up here, I would have said absolutely not. So that's a piece to know. The second piece is that the purpose in education is to form us as humans, right? So whatever you think you want to do, ask yourself as you go through a degree program, what am I learning from this? What am I trying to gain? And how is this going to help me be a better human out of it? One of the biggest issues that I see when I interview people as a supervisor is that people can't articulate what they learned in college, right? They can say, I got a degree in X, engineering or whatever it is. But what did they learn? How did they change? Who did they become as a result of that? And so both when you're looking at which college to go to and as well what you major in, that's a bigger question, I think, than what the piece of paper at the end says. So obviously, if you want to be a nurse, you have to have a nursing degree. And, there's some requirements like that. But in general, I'd rather hire a philosopher that can think clearly than I would a nuclear engineer who had the technical background but couldn't think.
Excellent advice. Well, Spence, I know you just published a book. Give us the summary of your book and tell us where can we find your work.
Well, so I just published The Christian Mind of C.S. Lewis, which is a collection of volumes in honor of Michael Travers. He was a longtime professor there at Southeastern. And so it's a really pretty good collection of works. I got Leland Ryken that contributed, James Como, who's a C.S. Lewis expert, and a number of people that knew Michael Travers well. And so we wrestle with the question, why is Lewis so interesting? And the answer is, I think, because of how he thought about everything, and his worldview fit everything into it. And so that collection might be a little dry for some of your students, but there's a lot of good stuff in it too. So you can find that at Amazon or whatever. It's out there and published. Just came out in December. If people are interested in other things that I've written, including a review of that book on nuclear power, I write on my own blog at ethicsandculture.com. And I also write for the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. I write for the Intersect Project at Southeastern, and pretty much anywhere else that I have time for along the way.
Wonderful. I have seen buzz about the Christian Mind of C.S. Lewis. I did not realize that was your project. That's so exciting. I'm going to have to get a hold of that. I'm doing a class this semester on Edmund Spencer's Fairy Queen, and I didn't know until I started taking the class that Lewis loved the Fairy Queen. And I think about every time I've met with the professor, I've found some new spot that just seems to me to be a direct connection between Narnia and Fairy Queen. So it's new stuff on the mind of Lewis is always interesting. So I'm going to have to get a copy of your book and check that out.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight and lending us your expertise. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you also for joining us for this episode of What's the Res? If you want to get in touch with us to leave us any feedback, help us know if this information was helpful to you as you were writing your cases, you can do that in a variety of ways. You can reach us by email at whatsttheres@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit at the handle at whatsttheres_. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/whatsttheres. And just in case you can't get enough debate in your life, you can also subscribe to the premium side of our podcast. You can go to our website at whatsttheres.com and click the banner there. That'll take you over from the free side to the premium side, where every month we release a new recorded debate, real debates by real people, where we debate the controversial issues of the day. So please do check that out. Thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate your support. And until next time, work hard, speak well, and seek the truth.